12. We'll be reading Luke chapter 12, verses 35 through 48. Luke 12, 35 through 48. Stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning, and be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the wedding feast, so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at table, and he will come and serve them. If he comes in the second watch or in the third and finds them awake, blessed are those servants. But know this, that if the master of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have left his house to be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Peter said, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for all? And the Lord said, Who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom his master will set over his household to give them their portion of food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that servant says to himself, My master is delayed in coming, and begins to beat the male and female servants, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of the servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. And the servant who knew his master's will but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required. And from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand all the more. The return of Christ is a central teaching of the New Testament. It's not one of those matters of conscience that we're allowed to disagree about. It's very clear in Scripture that Jesus will return. In fact, this is dealt with by Paul, that, for example, in 1 and 2 Thessalonians, he will return, and don't think otherwise. Don't let anyone fool you into thinking otherwise. In fact, Paul later says that by a misunderstanding and a misteaching of the return of Christ, some people's faith were being upsetted. And Paul is very clear that the return of Christ is central to the New Testament, central to our lives, how we make sense of the world, and why we behave the way that we do. And it is the way Christians look to the future. That is, for us, kind of the next step is Jesus' return. That is although it's not always easy to do, the primary next step. Sometimes we get focused on our lives, our issues, our appointments we have to keep, meetings we have to have, people who we're visiting. But that's not really the next step. Or even death itself, we sometimes look at as the next step, but that's really not the next step. The next step in our lives that we focus on, that we set our attention to, is the return of Christ above all else. And when we get distracted from that, we get distracted from what's important. It's no coincidence that being distracted from the return of Christ leads to being distracted from what is important in life. Now, the return of Christ, although it's very important, is sometimes mishandled even today, which is to say sometimes people focus on parts of it they should not focus on. I'll give you an example. Very often, the return of Christ, when it is discussed, the focus is on when will he return? When's it going to happen? I don't know about you, but I've seen even billboard advertisements from people and groups and organizations saying, on this day, Jesus will return. We've done the math. We've calculated it out. This is what's going to happen. And people get really fixated on when is Jesus going to return? What's it going to look like? What's going to happen? But Jesus himself, although to an extent he did discuss what it is going to look like and what is going to happen, he did not discuss when it is going to happen. In fact, he himself said he doesn't know. What he really focuses on is how we are to be ready for his return. How to be someone who is prepared for the return of Christ. That was his focus. That's what we just read here. Jesus, in discussing his return, asks people to focus on how to be ready. And that's what our focus this morning is going to be. How do we do this? How can we be people who are ready for Jesus' return? And I think there are a number of things we could discuss concerning this, but I'm going to use this passage, and like any good sermon, it's going to be a 3-point sermon, where we're going to look at 3 different things we can do to be ready for Jesus' return. The first is we need to have an accurate view of ourselves as Christians. We need to understand who we are as Christians. Because the way we view ourselves affects much of our own behavior. Someone who thinks they're the most important person in the world is going to behave in a certain way, aren't they? And someone who thinks they're not of any importance at all is also going to behave in a certain way. So the way we view ourselves is very important. And the view we're given here by Jesus is we are servants. We are servants. Very important for us to keep in mind that we are servants. We have been bought with a price. We belong to someone else. We belong to a master. That's what a servant has. A servant has a master. And it's very important for us to remember this, to not be distracted from the fact that we don't belong to ourselves anymore. We willingly gave that up when we became Christians. We knew that we had sold ourselves into sin, into that bondage, that slavery. And we came to Christ and we said, please purchase me back. And he did. We are his servants. Now, of course, we're referred to as a number of different things. If you're here in our Hebrews class, you know we're referred to as brothers and sisters of Christ. There are a number of different ways Christ refers to Christians. But one here, very important way we view ourselves and understand ourselves, is as servants. And servants do things. They act a certain way. There are expectations of certain servants. And I want us to take a moment and just ask, what is the essence of being a servant? You know, if you say to someone, you're a servant, there are contexts and there is information that is contained in that. There are expectations there. What is it? What does it mean to say we are servants? And I'm going to give you 2. At least 2. I think we've actually already hit on a couple of different ones. One is that we are workers. We are workers. A servant works. A servant does things. A servant is expected not only to work, but to work in a certain way. And this is why we aren't just referred to as servants, but we're often referred to as stewards. A steward is someone who takes care of the things of their master in the way their master wants it taken care of. That's what a good steward does. So if I leave my house and I have, a butler, and I say to him, I'm leaving the house, here are my instructions for what I want you to do, I expect him to do it in the way I want it done. And rightly so, I expect that. That's his occupation. That's his role in this whole relationship. And in the same way, Christ not only expects us to be workers, but to work in the way he wants it done. And sometimes when we hear that, I think we immediately go to, well, I need to go out there and be evangelizing. I need to pick up my megaphone, go to a corner and start yelling at people. And I want to suggest to you that actually being a worker for Christ is much different than that. Who knows? Maybe there may come a time where that is what is expected of us. But if you read, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, when we're referred to as the salt of the earth and the light of the world, what is expected of us is to be people who understand and maintain and manage anger. People who don't lust after other people. Right? People whose yes is yes, our no is no. It's in all those little things that our light shine. And it's in all those little things, I think, that our work is often done as servants. As Jesus himself said, that one who gives a cup of cold water in his name will by no means lose his reward in heaven. We need to understand it's really not the big things that are often expected of us. For some people, it is expected. But I think the majority of us, it's the little things that we're workers, that make us workers. Because those things can be really hard. It can be really hard to be someone whose yes is yes, whose no is no. It can be really hard to be someone who tells the truth all the time. That can be hard. So what is the essence of being a servant? It's being a worker. That's one thing that's really expected of being a servant and what it means to be a servant. The other is belonging. A servant belongs to someone. A servant is bought by someone, paid by someone. A servant belongs to someone. And we must never forget that we belong to Christ. We belong to God. We are his. We are his servant. So in examining the return of Christ, it's very important for us to have an accurate and right view of ourselves and who we are. We are servants. In order to do this, to put it in biblical terms, this is humility. This is being humble. I think humility is really often misunderstood. For example, sometimes when we talk about humility, we act it out as if, let me give you a scenario. Someone is an excellent basketball player, and they know they're an excellent basketball player. And someone comes up to them and says, "You're an excellent basketball player." We think humility is responding, "No, I'm not." That's not really humility. In fact, that's lying if we know we're an excellent basketball player. Humility is having an accurate view of ourselves. Being honest about our strengths. Being honest about our weaknesses. It's not wrong to be an excellent basketball player and to know it, and to be honest about it. It is wrong to start thinking that I'm better than other people because I'm an excellent basketball player. That's where pride starts getting in and people are no longer being humble. But humility is having an accurate and honest view of ourselves. And here, before we transition, I want to leave you with one last thought. That having an inaccurate view of ourselves can cause a lot of harm and a lot of destruction. I'm going to give you two examples. One is, if we think we're better than other people, we will never be able to forgive them. As long as we think we're better than someone else, we will never be able to forgive them. I don't know all of the exact psychological reasons why that happens. I just know it's true. When we have an inaccurate view of ourselves and we think we're better than other people, we will never be able to forgive those people. That's one example of the destruction of having an inaccurate view of ourselves. Another example is when we think we're worthless, we will never sacrifice anything. We may give things up, but that's not the same as sacrifice, because sacrifice is offering something that is of value. But if we think we're worthless, why would we offer anything? See, when we have an inaccurate view of ourselves, it really messes things up along the lines. If we think too highly of ourselves and we think we're better than other people, we won't forgive anyone. But if we think too little of ourselves, we won't sacrifice anything because we won't think our sacrifices mean anything. It's very important for us to have an accurate view of ourselves. And we are servants. That doesn't mean we're less people. That doesn't mean we have no value. It means we have a certain kind of understanding of who we are. We have work to do. We belong to someone. So first of all, in examining the return of Christ, how to be someone who is ready for the return of Christ, you have to view yourself rightly. You have to view yourself accurately. And here, one thing we see is we are servants. Next, in order to be ready for Christ's return, we must have a right relationship with our Master. We must have a right relationship with our Master. I want you to read these verses with me. In Luke chapter 12, verses 35 through 38. Stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning, and be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the wedding feast, so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at table, and he will come and serve them. If he comes in the second watch or in the third and finds them awake, blessed are those servants. I want you to just imagine this scenario for a moment. Jesus gave us these scenarios for us to imagine them. And the scenario is that a master of some kind returns from what he says a wedding feast, kind of banquet, a celebration. And he goes up to his own house and he knocks on the door. Why is he knocking on the door of his own house? It's very interesting, isn't it? Why is he knocking on the door of his own house? And I think, you can take this with a grain of salt, I think the reason is because the door is locked. See, Jesus presents his return as giving the power of his return into the hands of his servants. I mean, if you're a master and you come to your own house, you probably have a way to get in. You probably have a back door of some kind, a master key of some kind. And he doesn't. He doesn't do that. He knocks at the door. And I think Jesus is giving us an image of He is allowing these servants the opportunity to not open the door, to keep the door closed. He's giving them that opportunity. Jesus, throughout many of his teachings, is very concerned with the question, if you could, would you? If you could, would you? For example, in the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about a person who looks at a woman with lustful intent, has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Well, the real issue there is, if you had the opportunity to commit adultery and you could get away with it, would you do it? See, many people are adulterers. They just never committed adultery because they didn't have the right opportunity. Or were afraid of getting caught or something like that. The question is, if you could, would you? This is why in 1 John we read that everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. Why is that? Because when you hate someone, you wish that they did not exist around you anymore. You think your life would be better if they were out of it. And if you were given the right opportunity and you could get away with it, you would probably take them out. You would probably murder them. Imagine you were given a button, and God gave you this button and said, if you push it, Jesus will never return. Would you push it? It means you would never have to stand in judgment. It means you wouldn't have to be raised from the dead. You could just live your life however you wanted and die and go into the ground, and that would be the end of you. If you were given the option of pushing the button, would you? If you were given the option of keeping the door locked, would you do it? I think that's what's going on here. Now, obviously, we know when Jesus returns, that's not what it's going to be like. He's not going to, knock on the atmosphere and wait to see if humanity lets him in. But I think he's given us an image, a kind of mental exercise. If the master comes and knocks on the door, are you willing to open it for him? Or would you keep it locked? See, in order to have a right relationship with our master, we need to be the kind of people who would let our master in, even if it means standing in judgment, even if it means being exposed for who we are and what we've done. To have a right relationship with the master is to be the kind of person who would let the master in if we were given the opportunity of keeping him out. This is one way to have a heart that is prepared for the return of Christ, is to be someone who welcomes it, who looks forward to it, who has nothing to fear when it happens. To have a heart that is ready to be exposed and to be judged. That is what it means to be prepared for Christ's return. So in order to be prepared for Christ's return, we need to have a right relationship with our master. And I'm putting this into two terms. This means, first, being the kind of servant who wants to let your master in. And second, it means doing the things the master asks of you. So in verses 42 through 44, Jesus says, "Who then is the faithful and wise manager whom his master will set over his household to give them their portion of food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions." To have a right relationship with the master, we need to be servants who actually do the things the master asks of us. When the master asks us to give people their food at the proper time, we do it. Now, this is just my interpretation here. I think primarily what's being talked about here is the response to Peter's question in verse 41, "Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for all?" And I think this is a reference to teachers and leaders in the church, specifically these apostles, feeding the church at the proper time, if you will. Giving them the right teachings. But I don't think it's limited to just that. I think there's a principle here that, yes, certainly applies to these apostles in particular, and does apply to all teachers in the church. You've got to be someone who is able to feed the church at the proper time. But it is a general principle that we can extrapolate for all servants. All servants are to be people who are willing to do what their master asks of them. Let me ask you a question. Does Jesus give us too much to do in the Bible? Does this overburden us? I think it's a really important question to ask. Have we been given too much to do? Sometimes it certainly feels that way, doesn't it? And the question we really have to answer is, does it feel that way because Jesus has given us too much to do, or does it feel that way because of things we've put into our lives? See, we need to be people who do what the master asks of us, but it's really hard to do what the master asks of us if we feel like the master is just overburdening us and giving us way too much to do. Here, what's given to them to do is, for example, to stay up late and to wait to let the master in. You have in verse 38, if he comes in the second watch or in the third and finds them awake, blessed are those servants. That's about 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. Imagine someone said to you, in fact, I'm sure some of you have had this happen. I know I have, where I've had to wait up for someone. They said, like, I don't have a cell phone, I don't have reception, I'm going to arrive sometime between this time and this time. And if someone says, I'm going to arrive sometime between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m., that means waiting up all night, potentially. If you have to wait up all night for someone you don't like, it's really hard to do, isn't it? But when you have to wait up all night for someone you love and you care about, it's not too much. And I think that will help us be people who do the things the Master asks of us without feeling overburdened, is by just loving our Master. Because when people we love and we care about ask too much of us, it often doesn't feel like too much. I should say what seems like too much. It often doesn't feel like too much. As servants, we have a master, and in order to have a good relationship with this master, we are to do the things that the master asks of us. But I want to encourage you first to be someone who wants to let your master in. Because if you are someone who doesn't want to let the master in, but you try to do all the things the master tells you, it will just lead into legalism. It will just destroy you from the inside out. If you try to do all the things Jesus wants you to do, but you have no respect, regard, or compassion or love for Jesus, it will just feel like he's given you a list of things to do that's too much. We need to first have hearts that would let Jesus in, even if we were given the opportunity to keep him out, before we can do the things the master asks of us in the way the master wants them done. So, how do we prepare for the return of Christ? We here see that it means having a right relationship with our master. Being someone who would let the master in. Being someone who does the things the master asks of us because we are his servants. Lastly, how we can prepare for the return of Christ is by having a right relationship with others. We have this image here in verses 45 and 46, a very disturbing one, of a gluttonous and drunk servant. We read, "But if that servant says to himself, 'My master is delayed in coming,' begins to beat the male and female servants, to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful." In this example, Jesus gives us this servant who sets some principles for us. What's going on here is the servant is Jesus saying he's a drunkard and a glutton. He's eating, he's drinking, he's getting drunk, he's just indulging himself. And that's really the principle for us that we pull from this. We're not just talking about eating and drinking, although for some it may include that. We're talking about indulgence. We're talking about giving into our various lusts. That this is the actions of a person who believes in the delay of Jesus' return, or that he won't return at all. Indulgence here is really the principle. And I want you to notice that his indulgence is not isolated. It's not solitary. he then goes on to beat his fellow servants. Because one of the mistakes we make is thinking that an act of sin can be just about me. And it's not. God has not designed us that way. There is no sin that is only about me. It affects other people, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly, by changing me and my behavior and the way I behave toward other people. Sin has a very relational effect. There is no solitary act of sin, and this leads to this mistreatment of others. And here is a very, very important principle, that to be someone who is ready for the return of Christ is to be someone who has a right relationship, not just with God, not just with myself, but with other people. Particularly here, we're talking about other Christians. This is the principle here of beating people. It doesn't have to be, violence. It doesn't have to be, two of you go out into the parking lot after a sermon and start, fisticuffs. The principle here is the mistreatment of other people. And this comes about in all various ways, shapes, and sizes. Sometimes it is violence. I've seen Christians come pretty close to throwing punches. Sometimes it's things like slandering, backbiting, gossiping. Sometimes it's belittling people, looking down on them. It's the mistreatment of other people. And that at all does not prepare us for the return of Christ. In fact, the person who is doing this is the person who thinks Jesus won't return. And Jesus very insightfully connects a person's readiness for Christ's return with a person's relationship with other people. I don't think we always associate these things together. We often associate whether I'm ready for Christ's return as like, have I been forgiven? Right? How's my relationship with God? Or is there something I've done that I need to repent of, and do I have enough time to do it? I think we don't always realize that our readiness for Christ's return actually also depends on our relationship with one another, how we treat one another. And if we're mistreating one another, is that evidence that we're not really ready? Is that a manifestation of the thought that my master is delayed in coming, as we see this servant here? How we treat one another is also a part of being ready for Christ's return. Because the Bible consistently links together our relationship with others and our relationship with God. Very consistent, all through the Old and the New Testament. Jesus, for example, in discussing the two greatest commandments, says the first is to love God with heart, soul, and mind. And then Jesus says the second is like it, to love one's neighbor as oneself. Now, under the law, those two commandments, it's not like they appeared right next to each other. People had understood by the time of Jesus that these two go together, and Jesus himself confirms this, that the first is to love God with all of you. The second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Because the way we treat others is the way we treat God. I mean, for those of you who have children, if someone hurts your child, doesn't it also hurt you? If someone hurts someone you love, doesn't it also hurt you? See, when we hurt people, it is also an attack on God. Because God loves people. And so our relationship with others is tied up with our relationship with God. There's no separating it. There's no getting around it. This is how God has made us, and this is what we have to deal with. Our relationship with others, then, is central to whether or not we are ready for Christ's return. This wicked servant, we read in verse 46, is really condemned. And Jesus says that he will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful or the unbeliever, some translations say. I like the translation unfaithful, because I think there are two ways we can read this. Unfaithful first, meaning this is someone who doesn't trust God, who doesn't trust Christ, who doesn't say God's ways are better. They don't trust God's ways. That's someone who is unfaithful. They're unfaithful toward God in that respect. But unfaithfulness can also mean I'm not trustworthy. You can't depend on me. And that's precisely what we see here with these servants. These are unfaithful servants. You can't trust them. You can't take your house, give it to them, and expect it to be taken care of while you're gone. They're untrustworthy. They're unfaithful. And this servant it says, cut up in pieces and thrown into this group of other people who are also called unfaithful. And I don't think we have to go far to realize this is really an image of hell. To be cast in with a group of unfaithful people. How would you like to spend an eternity with people you can't trust? That seems pretty awful, doesn't it? The kind of person we cannot trust. You can't trust them to tell the truth. You can't trust them not to steal from you. You can't trust them not to harm you, to hurt you in any way, not to take things that you prize. You can't trust them. How would you like to spend an eternity with people you can't trust? A group of unfaithful people. The French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote a play, and you may have heard of it. It's a very famous play. It is sometimes translated into English as No Exit. And the play it's only, I guess 4 characters technically, but 3 main characters. It's 1 man and 2 women, and they find themselves in hell. And they go into this motel room, and they're let in there, and the door is shut behind them and locked. Well, it's locked at moments. It's later unlocked, but that's irrelevant. They go into this hotel room, and they know they're in hell. And they're surprised, like, why are we in a motel room? One of them even comments, where are all the torture devices? Where are all the forms of punishment? And as they start interacting with each other, they begin to be malicious toward each other, to harm each other. The man, the reason he's in hell is because he had deserted his army and been executed for cowardice, and he yearns to be told he is not a coward. He can't stand the guilt. And the women there mock him. They make fun of him. They tell him, you are a coward. And they begin to realize they are each other's torture devices. And so very famously in the play, the man exclaims, hell is other people. Now, as Christians, we understand hell is a little more complicated than that. It is separation from God, separation from what is light, what is life, what is good. But there's also a lot of truth in that. How would you like to be in a place for eternity grouped in with the unfaithful? With people who don't trust that God's ways are better, and people you cannot trust themselves. That's awful. that is hell. But that's not who we are. That's not what we look forward to. Jesus gives us a warning, but he also gives us a great image of what to look forward to. These are servants who do the right thing. Servants who are ready for their master's return. Servants whose readiness does not go unnoticed. Because you read in verse 37, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, he will dress himself as the master. He will dress himself for service and have them recline at table, and he will come and service them." The master is going to then take care of the servants. He's going to serve the servants. And the servants are going to finally be in a place of rest, as we talked about in our class in Hebrews. See, faithfulness is not just about us trusting God, it's also about God trusting us. And in particular, trusting us to take care of one another, to have a right relationship with one another. God has designed us to be very vulnerable to each other. Nothing we can do about that. I am open. I am vulnerable to every one of you, and vice versa. And God trusts us not to take advantage of that vulnerability, not to hurt people, because God has given us tremendous power to hurt one another. But God is equally, in making us vulnerable, giving us tremendous power to do good toward one another, to encourage one another, to exhort one another. And God trusts us with his household, with his church, not to take advantage of the church, but to treat one another with gentleness, with respect, and to not take advantage of our vulnerabilities. Because we are all, more than we realize, open and vulnerable toward one another. Therefore, to be someone who is prepared for Christ's return, we are to have a right relationship with one another. Because God loves people. And the way we treat others is the way we treat God. Christ will return. There is no getting around that. And Christ has not given us the time of his return, but he has given us the instructions of how to be people who are ready for his return. We are to rightly understand ourselves. We are servants. That's who we are. And we are to have a right relationship with our master. We are to be the kind of servants who would let him in, even if he gave us the option of locking him out. And we are to be servants who have a right relationship with one another, to not take advantage of one another, to not mistreat one another as this wicked servant does, beating each other, to not give in to our indulgences, and to mistreat ourselves and our own bodies. If these are only three things, but if we start here, I think we can be people who are more ready, who are more prepared for Christ's return. If you're here this morning and there is anything coming between you and being ready for Christ's return, now is the time to get that out of the way. Now is the time to set that aside. Now is the time to be a person who has nothing to fear when your heart is exposed before our God and our Creator. If there's anything you can do, you need help with in order to be ready to stand before God, please talk to us. Please do not keep that inside. We won't look down on you. We won't make fun of you. We will help you in any way that we can. If you need prayers, if you're struggling, if you have questions that have come up in your own Bible studies, in your own research, if you have doubts, if there's anything at all that we can do for you, We ask that you would talk to us or even come forward now as we'll stand and sing the song of invitation.